Welcome to another episode of My Wake Up Call. This is the podcast where I find out a little bit about my guests and I save getting to know them a lot more for the podcast because I know that you, our listeners and viewers, like finding out not just what our guests are up to, but how they came to be up to it, what led them there, and their wake up calls along the way. So I'm pleased to introduce you to a Brit living in Portugal. That's probably another whole interview. Jeff Dewing, and his last name is spelled Dewing. He's a revolutionary tech innovator, #1 best-selling business author of Doing the Opposite. He's the podcast host of Business Disruptors, Doing the Opposite, and the founder of Cloud FM and Mindset. That's with 2 T's. Their tech has disrupted a 200 billion pound industry, and they've been named Queen's Award winner for innovation for 2019 and a global leader in the IoT-enabled predictive maintenance arena by Gartner. Jeff left school at 16. I wonder what that conversation was like with his parents. I'm leaving school, Mom and Dad. Working his way up the ranks as an engineer to owning a successful multi-million pound football club. But he lost it all and had only 7 pounds and 60 pence, I guess, in his bank account. Despite this, he managed to turn his life around, learned to code, and started a new business from his garden shed building and grew it into a 70 million pound company that he turned around. He's spearheading the technological revolution, now using game-changing tech to help businesses achieve net zero, and he's projected to achieve 250 million pounds by 2026. So, Jeff, it's great to have you on from Portugal.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so I will ask you what I ask everyone, which is, tell us what matters most to you. If you step back and say, I think this is kind of who I am, and this is what matters to me, and then tell us how that came to matter to you, which culminated in your first best-selling book, Doing the Opposite. So share a little bit of an origin story. Did you grow up to honor Mom and Dad, or to be the opposite of them, or to say, as you did at age 16, I'm just going to do it my own way, if you don't mind. So tell us about you.
So I guess the answer to the first part of the question is, what is it that matters to me? It's really interesting because I'm sort of in my late 50s now. And if you'd have asked me that question when I was 20, 30, 40, 50, I probably wouldn't have been able to answer it as well as I can now. And I'll explain the reason for that in a moment. But what's most important to me is values. Values, behavior, how we behave, how we treat people, and to be a lifelong learner. And a lot of those things are blocked with ego and pride and all the emotions we go through. But values are the most important for me. And my values, which happen to also be the business values because they're transferable, is integrity. Always tell the truth, no matter what the cost, no matter what the consequence. Tell the truth. Humility. We're not always right about stuff, and understand that we're not always right about that stuff. Freedom. The freedom to fail, because I have a saying that I use in my business that in our business you can't fail. You can only win or learn, because failure is a learning exercise. And then finally is empathy. Truly understand how the people are affected by your engagement. How do you impact? How do you make people feel when you come into contact with them? So they're my values. Now, if you'd have asked me that 10 years ago, wouldn't have been able to articulate it. It was only when I was asked to write the book 2 years ago that part of the exercise of writing the book, because I had to go back to my childhood. I had to go to my parents' house, spend a weekend, dig out all the old photographs. And bearing in mind, photographs in my generation, when you're 5 and 10 and 20 years old, were very few and far between, not like they are today with the smartphone. And so I dug out all these photographs, and suddenly all these memories come back. these photographs just come to life as though I was running around the speedboat that I'd got a photograph of, and so on and so on. And suddenly it dawned on me that my upbringing had entirely shaped my life. And there's some great little snippets, which I'll share with you a bit further on maybe, that helped me sort of understand what my purpose was, which I had no idea before, and why I found, and what's interesting is my book is called Doing the Opposite, which was something that was constructed in the detail of putting the book together, but I didn't know why until I went back to those photographs, and I learned that the reason I always do the opposite is because my father always did the opposite, but I could never link the two until I carried out that exercise.
So what did you notice about your father doing the opposite? Now again, he was your father. You didn't know any other different, but in retrospect, what can you remember that now tells you he was doing the opposite?
So I'll give you one example, and there's numerous ones, but I'll give you one. As a young child growing up, I was 15 years old. I was in school. I had some friends that were a couple of years older than me. And as a result of them being a couple of years older than me, they'd left school at 16, 17, and I was still in school. But they were good friends. And they would come knocking on my door and they'd say, and because they'd left school and they was now sort of in the adult world, they'd gone out and bought their 250cc motorbikes, and they was living the dream from a school child's perspective. And they knock on the door and they say, Jeff, you come out the pub, because we were all friends, always did everything together. And I was lucky enough I could pass off old enough to go to the pub. So I'd go to the pub. But of course, I wasn't in work. I was a school child. You know, I didn't have pocket money of any materiality. But my dad ran his own business, and every night he'd come home with a briefcase, and in that briefcase was a brown envelope full of the day's takings. So I decided I enjoyed going up the pub with my mates. I felt grown up and felt like I was moving into matureness, and so I ended up behaving badly, and I started taking some money from my dad's takings early in the morning before my mum and dad got up. And after about 2 weeks, and when I saw I was taking the equivalent to $5, which would buy me 2 or 3 pints of an evening in the pub. And after about 2 weeks, I got caught red-handed by my mum. And I love my parents dearly. We never had any, it was a great relationship. I had an incredible upbringing, caring, loving upbringing. So I was devastated. I wasn't devastated about being caught, which obviously was bad, but I was devastated about, I was ashamed that I'd actually carried out the act. Anyway, I got to school that day, and my dad was a workaholic. He never got home until midnight every night. He was out, he'd sleeping until 10 o'clock. We'd already gone to school. And I'm walking home from school the day after I got caught, thinking, if my dad's car's outside, I'm in deep trouble. Anyway, his car wasn't. And the next 2 and 3 days went past, his car wasn't. I thought, blimey, I've got away with this. This is wow, thank God for that. And then the next day after that bit of relief, I walked home at 4 o'clock and my dad's car was outside. I'd never seen it outside at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm going, that's it. It's all over for me. So I walked into the house, walked into the kitchen. My dad was in there having a cup of tea, and he said, hello, son. I said, hello, Dad. He said, what are you doing? So I said, oh, nothing really. I've just got to do a bit of homework and all that. I said, why? So I thought we'd go out, have a little trip. So I thought, oh my God, he's going to take me down the woods and kill me. So I was really, really quite worried. And anyway, we jumped in the car, and I had no idea where we was going. He wouldn't tell me. And we went to the high street, which is where all the shops were. And there was an Airfix shop. And for those that don't know what an Airfix shop is, it's like a typical model shop that a young kid, you know, it's like Christmas. You've got all these model aircraft and cars and whatever. And he said to me, what do you think about that aeroplane up there? And there was this big aeroplane hanging from the ceiling on strings. And I said, yes, that's brilliant, Dad. Why are you asking me? He said, I think we're going to buy that plane in a kit form, and we're going to build it together. We're going to put servos, we're going to put a little petrol engine in it. And then once we've built it, we're going to take it up Chingford Plains, a big grass field, and we're going to fly that plane together. I said, wow, yes, please, yes, please. So anyway, bought the airplane, come back, and we started building this each evening. He came home at 4 o'clock every day for the next couple of 3 weeks, and we sat down and we started building this airplane. And then my mates were calling me saying, Jeff, you come up the pub. I went, no, I'm spending time with Dad. I'm building an airplane. And we built the airplane, and then off we went and we flew it. The point behind the story was I had 2 sisters at the time, and they were sitting saying, what on earth is going on? He's been caught stealing money. Why is he not grounded, locked in his bedroom with punishment like you wouldn't believe? Why has he got this Airfix model and Dad's spending all this time putting it together? And And the answer to that question was, my dad did the opposite. What he said was, the root cause of the problem is Jeff is distracted. He took responsibility for the fact that he was always working. So he decided he wanted me to learn how to live a different life. And rather than punish me for doing something, he took responsibility for the fact that the environment in which I was growing up, I had a choice to go the wrong way as well as the right way. So he done something that absolutely made me think about what had happened. And he did the complete opposite. And that was one example. There's many like that, where he did the opposite of what most parents would have done in those environments.
That's a wonderful story. I want to share one with you. I have a friend who's a rabbi, and he runs a men's group, and he was sharing something about he had 9 children, and he said, whenever my children do something wrong and we catch them, they know they've done something wrong. We don't have to convince them they've done something wrong. They already know it. And then if we add to it, you've done something wrong, it wasn't going to be that helpful. So one of the things that he used to say to his children, because they were expecting a lecture or punishment, he would say, you know what you just did? Yes. That's not who I believe you to be. In fact, I think down deep, it's not who you believe yourself to be. And I think it's just out of alignment with that. And I thought that was so freaking eloquent. And it is a lot like doing the opposite, but rather than punishing, he was seeing the goodness in them and just assuming that if they did something, he didn't know why, but it really wasn't who they were, because who they were was really a good person. And the down deep, they believe that. But it's along the lines of kind of what you said.
Yeah. But how do you tap into that in a safe environment? And I think, the lesson I learned, not just because of what my dad did with me, but the lesson I learned was that when you take an action, when you react to something, when you do something, you make a decision, even though you might know it's wrong, until you actually feel the impact of that wrongness, you can't react to it. So another example is I always use the analogy that when you say to your children and you're teaching them to ride a bike and they've got stabilizers on and you're about to take them off, and you sit there as parents and you say, be careful, don't fall off. If you fall off, it will hurt. You've got to be careful. Don't go too fast. And because as parents, we're concerned about our children hurting themselves. But we have to realize that those children will take no notice of those words. The only time they learn is when they've fallen off the bike. And we have to afford them that opportunity.
Absolutely. I'll share something else, but then it's your podcast, so I don't want to take it over, which I sometimes do. So something my listeners know, but you don't know, is one of my specialties when I was in practice, I'm retired, was suicide prevention. And none of my patients died by suicide in over 30 years. And the approach, I didn't realize it was doing the opposite. To me, I look at it as I was doing what was needed as opposed to what was the common practice. So my way of listening to the world is lessening hurt in the world. I think the world runs away from hurt and fear into destructive behaviors.
Yeah.
And it's a global epidemic, and what I've discovered is that when you can make it safe enough or for people to share what they're hurt, afraid, or disappointed about, and then you don't judge them, just the fact that they're sharing those things and you're not judging them, they start to cry with relief, because usually what they do is they run away from hurt, fear, and disappointment. into coping behaviors that are destructive.
Yeah.
And then the world reacts to all those coping behaviors and puts them down. So when I would listen to people, I wouldn't listen focused on how do I treat their illness. I focused on how do I hear their hurt so they can tell me it.
Yeah,
if that makes any sense. Yeah,
it makes total sense. That comes back down to, people say they hear, but do they listen? And I think listen, it's an art, because unfortunately we're wired, aren't we? We come through society, upbringings, whatever, and we're wired along those lines. I mean, a human being is born with two fears, and two fears only. One is loud noise, and two is falling backwards. Every other fear we have is wired into us on our journey. And when one of the things you've just said there, I'd sum up with something that I found very powerful, and that maybe that will come out a bit later in the conversation, but the power of vulnerability. And that's not the power of vulnerability to control situations. It's the power of vulnerability to attract the ability for people to help you and not judge you. When you're vulnerable, people don't want to judge you. They don't have a need to judge you. And vulnerability brings the best out in people. But it's got to be authentic, obviously. But vulnerability is the most powerful tool I've experienced as a leader.
So tell us about how you discovered that, and how you discovered its power as a leader.
So I've run businesses most of my life. I've been involved at very senior level in various corporate businesses. And when I started the current business in 2012, I started to build a business which ended up with 400 people. And I was a typical entrepreneur. I was very experienced. I'd learned a lot. I loved people. I loved engaging people. But I was also the owner and the leader, which meant I had to have all the answers, right? I was expected to have all the answers. And when things were a bit rocky and a bit rough, people turned to me and said, Jeff, what are we going to do? Because I created that environment. And then we come to COVID. And even though I was growing as a leader, and I joined a few peer groups and realized that I needed to be curious and learn a lot more, which I went on that journey, and I loved every minute of it. And it transformed my life. But then we hit COVID, and we were in our industry, which is facilities management. Our primary client base was restaurants. So as you can imagine, when we went to lockdown, every restaurant closed. So we were collecting 6.5 million sterling per month in revenue. And on March the 22nd, that dropped to about £200,000 a month. So it fell off a cliff. And I've got 400 mouths to feed, and we've got no idea what's going to go on. So one of the things I'd learned in my journey was the power of clarity and communicate, the three most powerful words that you have to use in business. So how do I communicate with 400 people who have been sent home, fearful of their jobs, fearful of their livelihoods, fearful of what's going to happen, not to mention the health element of the scare of the pandemic. So I decided I need to communicate at least once a week with a video message, which would be engaging, where I would tell them exactly what was going on, good, bad, or ugly. This is what's happening. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. And when I got to my third message, the third week in, which was towards the end of April, where we still didn't have a clue about what was going to happen. We still didn't have confirmation from our government about what they later called furlough, where people were going to be supported financially. We still had no idea. And I sat on this call and I said, I'm now just going to give you an update on what we know and what we don't know. And because nothing had moved further forward, and the fear I saw in people's eyes, as I was talking to the team, the group, of which there was 400 people online, I choked up. I struggled to get my words out. And I tried to put the brave face on and pretended it was a long pause, but I was in trouble. And that's the first time I'd ever in a leadership role shown any form of vulnerability, but it was genuine. I was emotionally in trouble. And people didn't recognize that in me. And what knocked me for six was, as you'll know, on Zoom, you have the chat facility. And suddenly I got messages coming in so fast from people going, Jeff, we've got your back. Chin up, chin up. It even makes me emotional now thinking about it. That suddenly, as a group, we became so strong and powerful, because it wasn't Jeff leading 400 people. It was 400 people leading 400 people. Everybody was looking after each other. And that was the day I learned about the power of vulnerability.
Wow, that's a wonderful story. Were you able to keep that lesson going forward? Uh, Again, you don't want to fake or force vulnerability, but were you able to incorporate that into your leadership going forward? Or have people seen you get emotional since?
I've realized that I don't need to put up any more barriers or any more fronts, because what then happened was, as you can imagine, that was only 3 weeks into the pandemic, and we've got to come up with a plan. How we're going to survive, what we're going to do. And I had an executive board of 6 people. And again, they were very used to me driving the agenda and suggesting what we should or shouldn't do. And they would contribute because they're very clever people. But on that next management meeting, which was a week after that event that I just mentioned, they said, and we used to have meetings every day because it was so serious. And what's happening today? What we're going to do? And they said to me on this particular first meeting, which was on a Monday morning at 9 o'clock, we had the small talk, and they said, right, come on in, Jeff, what we're going to do? You're always focused on these weird and wonderful ideas. You always reach for the stars. What's the plan? And for the first time in my career ever, I said to them, I have got absolutely no idea. In fact, I need to share with you that I'm not even sleeping, and I can sleep standing up. One of the superpowers I have is I always get great sleep. Nothing stops me. But this was stopping me, and they knew that I had no problem sleeping. So when I said I'm not even sleeping, that obviously made them think, sit up. And I said, I can't. I'm in big trouble. I don't know what to do. And they'd never heard me say that. Anyway, excuse me. We had the call. We went through some bits and pieces, and I come off the call, and I went and sat on I've got a lovely patio out the back of my house where I get to look at the sea every day, and the sun sets every day, which is fantastic. So I went out there and I just sort of started wandering in my own thoughts. And then something incredible happened over the next couple of weeks. That team of 6 people stepped up 77 gears and took ownership of everything. And they came back to me and said, take 2 days off, go and relax, go and spend time with your thoughts. We're going to take over from here. And they said, check back in with us in a couple of days, and we'll share with you what our thought process is, which I did. And when I came back, they had built 7 different scenarios about how we're going to react to different scenarios that we didn't know about. And those plans were, not only were they incredible, they was articulate, they clearly been thought through, they had been at it for the last 3 days non-stop. And suddenly these people became giants, absolute giants, just through my vulnerability, which I was clearly constraining them previously through lack of vulnerability. And that's when I realized the power of the human being. When you truly empower them and truly trust them, they'll blow you away.
I want to add to that humility. I want to share a story, not about me, but do you know who Alan Mulally is?
I do, yes. I've heard of Alan Mulally, yep.
Yeah, so Alan Mulally, then you probably know the story I'm about to share, so I'll make it brief, although the listeners will want to hear it. So Alan Mulally was at Boeing for many years, and then he was pulled over to Ford to run Ford. And he didn't know anything about cars. He knew about planes. And he gets to a meeting with his executives, and he said, what's happening with this model, the Edge? And they used to have a system, red, yellow, green. Green is we're good. Yellow, we got an issue. Red, we got a problem. And everyone said, oh, it's green. And he said, really, it lost a couple $2 billion. And Mark Fields, the COO of the Americas, said, red, bright red. And what Alan did, and this is the humility, and I'm not sure if it was driven by fear or it's just who he is. Anybody says this is who he is he says, this is a big company. There's people in Ford who've got answers to our problems. Let's just find them. Mm-hmm. And that's what he did. So he led by realizing that believe in your people, and believe that they have the answers. but don't just say it because it's a nice thing to say, and
No.
really what you are is kind of a arrogant know-it-all, but you're just making it look like you're not. And that's what he practiced. And
Mm.
Ford was the only car company that didn't need to be bailed out,
Mm.
during the the Great Recession. But your story reminds me of that. That if you can
Mm.
step back and let go of needing to be in charge, needing to be in control, and replace it with knowing you have good people and just believing in them.
Mm.
That's
Yeah,
really
yeah.
incredibly empowering.
Yeah, and I use a lot of things that sort of guide me, and I say that you have to travel a long way to find a bad person. You don't have to travel very far to find a good person in a bad environment, and it's all about how those people are afforded the opportunity to control or influence their own destiny. In our business now, we have, as you can imagine, a level of different responsibilities in the organization, from directors down to apprentices. But the one thing we practice, and we've learned to do this through COVID acceleration, is that the senior team and the experienced people will decide the strategy, but all of our insights, bar none, all of our insights come from the frontline staff, no matter whether an apprentice or an administrator or a secretary. The insight comes from the frontline. The insight, the learnings come from the frontline. And that's the bit, and that's about humility. That's about understanding that everybody can contribute. And if you think they can't, then unfortunately you're the one losing out.
Yeah, that is so true, because the frontline people are in touch with the customers and the clients, and so they know what the customers and clients are frustrated about. They know what they like,
Yep.
And you're absolutely right.
Mm.
Can you elaborate on some more of the values that you'd mentioned, and how you came to see them as being so valuable?
So one of the things that really drove it was, why did I decide to start a business in 2012? I'm in the facilities management industry. In the UK, that's a £200 billion industry. 1 in 7 adults in the UK work in facilities management. That gives an idea of scale. Globally, it's a £4 trillion industry. And what I found, and I've been in the industry since I left school, what I found during my journey was I found hundreds of thousands of incredibly talented people all behaving badly. And the reason they were behaving badly was because of the environment in which they was operating. They were in toxic environments. They were in environments that said, you can't tell the client the truth, otherwise they'll cancel the contract. And then, of course, as a result of that, people had to learn to have good memories, because they had to remember what lie they told last week. And that was the environment people have been in our industry for the last 30, 40, 50 years. And I couldn't live in that industry. I was very disruptive. And as a result, I couldn't hold a job down for more than 2 years, because I just threatened the status quo, and therefore it was easier just to get rid of me. So then I decided the only way I'm going to solve this problem is I need to start it embryonically for myself. And that was when the values kicked in. And on our walls, in our buildings, and on the backgrounds of our Zoom and Teams calls, there's one phrase: I don't care what it costs, tell the truth. You are backed to tell the truth. No matter what the consequences, tell the truth. So that's when the power of integrity came to life in that environment. The second thing was that people wouldn't try anything in these organizations. They were fearful of getting it wrong, because that meant there would be punishment of some description. There would be disciplinaries. There would be people would get fired. So as a result, you just had robots. People were not using their creative selves. Why would they? It was too dangerous. So the next value was freedom. You have the freedom to try anything, and I mean anything, and you have the freedom to fail, because that's how you learn. There are a couple of rules. You're not allowed to make the same mistake twice. And secondly is, before you go out and try something new, make sure you have collaborated with your colleagues to see what their views of your opportunities are. And provided you've done those two things, you can try whatever you like. And suddenly these people became giants. They become unbelievable. And of course, when you sit back and you listen to some businesses and leaders that even today are saying, I'm not sure I can trust people working from home. What if they're just watching telly? And what if they're just sitting in the garden sunbathing? And I feel so sorry for those people, because when they decide that someone is perhaps not ready to trust or not capable of a job that they've been employed to do, when they go home, they look after their sick mother or father. They look after their wife and their children. The wife gets stuck on the big motorway at 4 o'clock in the morning, pouring of rain, panicking. And the guy that you think, I'm not sure if he can carry out the job on this spreadsheet, will get in that car, drive 300 miles, go and rescue his wife, rescue his kids, get them home, solve the problem with the house, the car, getting the car back. They'll solve all the problems because they're human beings are very, very clever people. They will solve any problem thrown at them like they do every day, whether it be bills coming in that they can hardly afford, or whether it be debts that are mounting. They manage these situations, and we're asking whether they're capable of doing that spreadsheet. That's because we've been wired in a command and control environment that says we have to decide if these people are good. What we should be doing is sitting back, listening and watching and learning from these people, because they will teach you something every single day. And when you learn the power of that, your organization goes to a very high performing organization.
So when you interact with other people at your level in your industry or other industries, well, if your book and your philosophy is doing the opposite, do you run into people who kind of look at you like, how can you do that? That's not the way it's done. That's, you can't give them too much freedom. Do you run into that at all?
Yes, of course, because the people that say that are the people that have never had the courage to try it. So they just assume they already know the answer, and that's not listening, right? That's not collaborating. And again, I feel for them, and I understand why they do it, because let's be honest, most of my career I believed the same thing, until various circumstances enabled me to have the courage to try new things. And one of the things that gave me that courage, it wasn't just some penny that dropped for me one day. It was joining a peer group, and where I'm with like-minded CEOs that range from 5 million turnover to 500 million turnover, where you share best practice. It's very lonely at the top. You can't, there's a lot of times you can't talk to your wife, your family, your kids, your mum and dad, or whatever, about some of the challenges you're facing. Who do you talk to? And a peer group gives you that outlet. And it was since I joined the peer group 6 or 7 years ago where I probably learned the most lessons I've learned in my entire career. And when you talk about what do people around you say, well, the peer group also, the people in the peer group going, I can't see that working. And it's not until you say, well, look, I'm not going to try and convince you it's right or it's wrong, but I'm going to tell you the results of my actions, and you can make your own decision. But I think one of the things, I'll give you another example. In the construction industry, FM is deemed as part of the construction industry. And when you carry out any form of work for the construction industry, you'll do a quote, you'll do a tender, you go through the process of trying to win the work. And then you'll start negotiating payment terms, because in construction, payment terms are a big issue, right? And it can range between 30, 60, 90 or 120 days. It can even go into pay if paid and all sorts of different challenging environments. And that was something else I sat and realized in my first business. I spent 80% of my time chasing money. And I swore that I would never chase money again in my life. I'd set a business up that meant I didn't have to chase money. And the way I did that was I set the business up, created a product and created a solution that was in such high demand that I could go to the clients and say, when they said, right, payment terms, we normally pay in 60 days. Is that okay? I'd say, absolutely not. And they say, oh, well, we'll struggle for 30. I said, I don't want 30. What do I said, you've got 24 hours. I only give 24-hour credit. And I'm talking to companies like KFC, the second most recognized brand in the world. And if they said, well, that'll never happen, then I say, it was really nice meeting you. Please come back if ever you are prepared to look at 24 hours. It was a non-negotiable. Every client, bar none, pays us in 24 hours. So I've never had to chase a dime in my 10 years running this business. Now, if I tell people, and again, I've got peers in my peer group that are in the construction industry, and they look at me like I've got two heads. And they say, but that can't be, my clients would never agree to that. I said, that's because you've already decided they won't agree to it. You've already answered your own question, which is why you don't follow that path. you have to do the opposite. Provided you can explain why it's important and why it means I can invest all my time in solving problems for the clients because I'm not chasing money. And the clients are not spending all their time justifying to me why they didn't make the payment date. You suddenly become so much more efficient. So don't do the same thing and expect a different result.
You said something I wanted to drill down into, and I'm not sure if you know what you said, but what you said is once you find out that you have a unique solution to a problem that hasn't been solved, that's leverage. So if you have the same solution that everybody has to the same problem, you're a commodity. But if you can take the time, and maybe doing the opposite is taking the time, and instead of just being in transitional fear and panic, if you can say, so what is the problem they really have that nobody else has solved, that's costing them big time? And what if we could come up with a solution to that problem that nobody else has? Well, then the leverage we have is being able to articulate, this is our solution. This is our track record at supplying it, so we know it works. And if you're not interested, in what we require, we'll walk away. So I don't. Do you agree that that's an important element? That if you don't take the time to really sort that out, you don't have the leverage to walk away, because if you're just like everyone else, you're going to be just like everyone else.
Of course, and I think there's a couple of points on that. One is you're absolutely right. I mean, what is the pure meaning of entrepreneurialism? Entrepreneurialism is a true entrepreneur is not interested in making money. They're interested in solving unsolved problems, right? That's what drives them. And by doing that, you create your own uniqueness. And there's then another argument where you'll listen to businesses and business leaders talk about USP. What is your USP? And that's, what is your differentiation from your competitors? Well, if I ask you the question, what's the difference between Coke and Pepsi? People can't tell you. And the reason they can't tell you is because there is no difference, right? The difference between Coke and Pepsi is not what differentiates the product or what it is they're producing. It's about who they're doing it for. So there is distinctiveness between the two. There is not differentiation. And therefore, the only time that you come outside of that environment I've just spoken about is when you're able to solve a problem that nobody else has yet. Then you do truly have a USP. But that USP won't last long. And therefore you leverage it while the time it lasts. But then somebody's going to come and do something similar, and that's okay. But then you've got to realize, well, what makes you different? And it's not the differentiation is not what you do, it's who you do it for. And that's the journey that entrepreneurs have to go on and learn. And but again, coming back to what you said, yes, it is leverage, but there's one thing that's really difficult. When you're solving a problem that's not been solved before, you move into this journey of the people that are going to respond to that. And that's about early adopters, because if it's a new solution, you're going to have an early adopter to take it on board. So you have a narrow market by default. You're not going to attract the laggers. The laggers want to see everybody else doing it first. So it was also about understanding, what is the market you're trying to service, but and you've got a laser focus on that market. But the reality is, if you're going to make a real change in the world, it's not about a product or a service or a commodity. It's about a movement. Do you create a movement? And that's like, ESG and global warming and stuff like that. Politicians, governments, and the most impressive, incredible academic professors in the world know how to solve it, but nothing will change, because the only people that will solve the problem is the population. And therefore you have to create a movement to be able to make that happen. And that's where entrepreneurs come alive. That's how they know how to create movements.
I want to share an observation about you, which I think you'll like because it's a compliment.
I'm glad to hear it.
I run into a number of young entrepreneurs, and when they have really, either a good solution or there's something special about kind of what their company or they stand for. What I've been coaching them to do is you want to be more formidable and less forceful.
Mm.
Because when you're forceful, you're pushy. And when
Yep.
you're pushy, you take away the other person's ability to choose to deal with you because they have to deal with you, and people don't like that.
Mm.
And I'm sharing it with you because there's a quality you have in which you come off as formidable as opposed to pushy.
Mm-hmm.
And the formidable is, I think, tied to you've actually stand for these values, you put them into practice, you see the power of them. It does, and it feels like it's part of your DNA. And so you come off as standing for things
Mm-hmm.
and standing up for them, but because of that, you're not pushy.
Mm.
Because I'll get guests on the podcast and I'll take them aside and I'll say, you know, you got a great solution and you owe it to stop being so pushy about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I guess there's another sort of secret ingredient that I've learned, not because I'm any special, any better than anybody else, but something I've learned on the journey because of the power of people and relationships. And that is that when anyone engages in our business, and I love different views, I love different stories, I love opposing views because I love to learn why these people think these way, right? Not because I'm right and they're wrong. I'm just intrigued. But when we bring people into our business, we don't sit there and look at their skill sets. We don't look at, are they highly qualified, partially qualified? Is their salary claims too high or too low? The first question we ask, we take them on a journey of explaining why we do what we do, why we exist, what our purpose is, etc., etc. And all we have to prove first and foremost is, do you believe what we believe? That's the only question. Because if you believe what we believe, and you convince us of that, you're going to be incredible in this team, because you can teach skills. You truly can teach skills. It's a lot harder teaching attitude and values because you need to establish what they are. But the only thing we focus on when bringing people into the business is we establish what are your values and do you believe what we believe. If they tick those boxes, they're in, and the people that come up, we have zero attrition in our business. So the Great Resignation doesn't work with us, not because we're any different or any special, because we treat people entirely differently. That's why we don't have people leaving. And it's all about bringing the right people in that believe what you believe. It's really basic stuff.
A friend of mine, Bill Liao, I think he lives in Ireland. He's, I think, a managing partner of some venture fund, and he was telling me exactly what you're saying. He was saying, you know, you should hire for values, and values cross over races, genders, generations. And he said, so for instance, if your values are integrity, responsiveness to the customer, not lying, you know, those can cross over. Being compassionate, those will cross over.
Mm-hmm.
He says, now if your values are ROI, quick profits, shareholder value, those values cross over with each other, but they don't cross over with the former values. And so you will never get someone who's focused on, you know, ROI and near-term results to ever get along with people who focus on the values of, you know, integrity, communication, mutual respect, and that sort of thing. So it's I think it's so aligned with what you're saying.
And when you talk about doing the opposite, you know, when we bring guys in, whether it be business development or whatever, I love saying things that raise an eyebrow. I say to anybody in the business, no one in this business will ever get fired for not hitting their numbers, because it's not about numbers. No one in this business will ever get fired for not hitting their targets. It's not about targets. It's about purpose. It's about outcome. It's about making a difference. the money, the profit, the EBITDA will follow. Do not chase the money. You're going down a dead end road. Chase the purpose, the outcome, and the problem solving. Everything else follows. But of course, when you're a business that's geared around shareholder value, by default, you're creating the wrong behaviors, and it's not sustainable. And that's why you'll have, whether it be venture capitalists, whether it be private equity, they're forever moving around every 3, 4, 5 years because they've made their money and they're off again. They don't really care about the outcome. And it's like a government. They're in power for 5 years. They don't care about what they leave behind. So, if you're going to truly solve a problem, and you're truly passionate about it, never chase the money. Chase the outcome that you're trying to seek.
So any thoughts about how to get this message embraced by public companies who, I guess at some level, have to care about shareholder value? Or do you need a strong enough leader? I remember Jim Sinegal, who was one of the CEOs of Costco, one of my favorite quotes that I heard from him. He was having a shareholder meeting and they said, can't you increase the margins at Costco? I mean, can't you do that? And can't you reduce some of the benefits to the employees? And Jim said to the shareholders, he says, I have 3 words for you. Sell your stock.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about how to, because there are these huge companies that employ many, many people, and they get squeezed by shareholders. Is there any way to get them to embrace what you're saying, or is it just a non-starter that shareholders think they own you? You're part of a portfolio. They look at numbers. People are selling them on numbers. Any thoughts about how big companies could do what you're suggesting they do?
Yes, and for me, again, it's the same solution. If it all comes down to expectations, right? So if you've got a private equity shareholders or whoever may or may not be, have been told we'll treble our ROI, our return on investment, we'll get 3 times what our investment was within 3 years. They've set an expectation, and they don't actually, perhaps at that point, understand what the opportunity of business are. So if you are chasing a purpose and you are focusing on an outcome, the profit follows. Now, to try and bring that to life, let me give you an example. We've been running for 10 years now, and we've been solving problems, and we've been growing as an organization, and we've had the ups and downs that COVID threw our way, as it did every other business. So for a little business that started in a garden shed with me, my wife, and my daughter in 2012, in the next 2 years, we'll be valued at 250 million. Now, that's massive return on someone that might have invested 150,000 quid 10 years ago. And that's an incredible return on investment, right? The problem is you've got an investor model where those investment houses are sitting there with what they know. They do the same thing, expect a different result or a better result, but still do the same thing. They spread bet across their portfolio, and they're only targeting 3, 4, 5, 6 times their investment, right? That's their return that they're looking for. Whereas if they said, no, actually, we're going to have a different view on this. We want to solve a problem. We want to solve climate change. We want to do whatever. And that's a 15-year investment. And provided we invest in the right people that are purpose-driven, going to solve the problem with an incredible team, blah, 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 they will get 20 times, 30 times their investment. But you then have to move from short-termist attitude to long-termist attitude. You also have to care that when you pass that solution on to somebody else because you're exiting, you're proud you're giving them an incredible business that they're going to go and make money on, but as a byproduct, not as a primary product. And when they think that way, they will then enjoy the riches. But until they can get out of doing the same thing and expecting a different result, and as Henry Ford said, and a few people have said, the definition of insanity: do the same thing and expect a different result. It's just pure insanity.
Help me understand, because I understand purpose, but when you say outcome, if you're a hammer, the world's a nail. When you say outcome to people that are ROI driven, outcome is a number. It's whatever. Yeah. So help me to understand that, because they are tied and tied to each other, purpose and outcome. Is the outcome in fulfilling the purpose, and the purpose is to solve the problem? Or say more about the outcome so that people don't confuse it with the narrow-minded outcome of kind of venture thinking people.
So a purpose-driven organization has a destination, and that destination is whatever that purpose drives. So for climate change, it might be that we become net zero. That's the outcome. That's the target we're heading for, right? A purpose-driven organization cares about one thing: enriching other people's lives. That's its purpose. How do I make other people's lives better by solving this problem? When you look at financial institutions, venture and PE, their outcome is to nourish their own returns. It's not about helping other people. So they'll argue that we've helped this business earn more money because we sold it for 4 times more its value, and therefore the shareholders earned 4 times whatever their investment was. But that's not purpose, is it? That's self-serving, right? So until you're in an environment where you realize that the only reason we exist as human beings on this planet is to contribute something to somebody else. That's the only reason we exist. It's to share knowledge, and it's to help each other progress in whatever form that looks like, whether it be in health or growth or career or whatever, or safety or security or removing poverty or whatever it is. We only exist to enrich other people's lives. And when people move into self-serving, not only do they reduce that ability to enrich other people's lives, but by default, they become untrustworthy because they're self-serving. And that's the difference between a purpose-driven company and a non-purpose-driven company.
I'd like to get your help on something. When I look at my life, I really would like your suggestion. When I look at my life, the thing I'm proudest of is I focused on suicide prevention, and none of my patients died from suicide in 30 years. I've connected with the founders of all the organizations that collectively could solve the teen mental health crisis in the world and stop suicide. Including McKinsey Health and Wellness, including the Family Office Exchange, the 380 wealthiest families in the world, including an organization called Vibrant Emotional Health, which just rolled out a new suicide hotline number, 988, so people could dial it, and about 8 more organizations, including ones that treat teen mental health. And I've connected with all the founders, and collectively together, if they could be coordinated, they could solve everything.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is many of them, if they're nonprofits, they need to survive, and they have a lane that they're in. For some of them, this is all well and good, Mark, but you need to send us clients or patients because we're venture backed and such and such. And so my approach is going to be, and I'd really love your input on this, because this is, given my age and some of my challenges, I'm running out of time.
Yeah.
And my next step is I'm going to send them a list of all of each other and say, I've connected with all the dots that could solve this problem globally. Do you want to be, I'm trying to find an entity, not me, that can manage it. It might be the American federal government. They just did a carve out of 1.7 trillion, and a bunch of that's going to mental health. But I'd really welcome, your thoughts, because it's that's kind of my vision. I'm in contact with the founders and say, do you want in? Do you want out? I'm not here to convince you. Do you want to solve this thing? And I understand you all need to survive, but any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I've just, perhaps to answer your question in a slightly strange way, I've recently met somebody who's Dutch and he wants to save the planet. And he is very inspiring, and he does various keynote speeches. He's become a good friend of mine over the last 2 years. And what he's done is he's learned how to tell the story of what he's doing and why it's important. And he's gonna save the planet by fixing the oceans, because the Amazon rainforest are not the lungs of our planet. The oceans are the lungs of our planet. No one knows anything about the oceans. And the oceans will solve the planet. If we built 2,500 engineered reefs and plopped them in the oceans tomorrow, we would have a net zero planet within 3 years, not 2050. So he's loved the oceans all his life. He's a professor of the oceans, and he's a very inspirational character, and he's very charismatic, and he's very passionate. He went on a crusade 18 months ago to solve this problem. He's got no money, but he's got a lot of knowledge. And he's now got Microsoft on board. He's got Apple on board. He's got IBM on board. He's got Santander on board. He's got the biggest organizations on the planet on board, who are about to finance him $500 billion to install these engineered reefs. And he's done that in 3 years of relentless push. But all he did was created an incredible story that's factually based, and he delivered that story, which meant people were putting their hands in their pockets there and then, not financially, but in terms of, I'm going to dedicate my time and effort to support this, because it was so inspiring. And he's brought us on board as well, and there's a number of other things. So what I would say to you, bearing in mind I obviously don't understand the detail to which you clearly do, because you've made it your life's work, but the key is, all people want to know is, what is the problem? Do I believe that's the problem? And are you convincing me there actually is a solution that I can contribute to in my lifetime? And you answer those questions in a inspirational delivery. It doesn't have to be you. It just needs to be someone that clearly comes across as passionate as you. You create a movement. And when you create a movement, you can solve anything.
That is wonderful advice. Yeah, it's going to have to be someone younger than me. So, I need to find that who is more dedicated to identifying and solving the problem, than having a lane that they need to support. So, so this has been wonderful. So, where do people find out more about you?
So I have a personal website, which is jeffdewing.co.uk, where you can go and read more about my personal story. My book that I wrote in 2020 by request of people around me tells the story of my journey. It's not a do and don't book. It's not a education on business. It's just my story and the lessons I learned and the failures I endured. And it's just a typical human story, although there's a few interesting pieces in there. What I'm most proud of is that it hit #1 globally on Amazon on the 13th of December 2021, sorry, which knocked me for six. So I had no idea it was going to attract that amount of interest. So the book is available on Amazon, and then my business is cloudfmgroup.com, which is the business that's currently running that I obviously operate. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn and the various other socials. And my podcast, which is Doing the Opposite Business Disruptors, is when, again, I bring people on that just share their stories, because that's where, as you said at the top of this podcast, you learn much, much more just talking to people, learning about people, creating a relationship with people than you'll ever learn reading a book. So, and I'm not obviously putting books down, I'm not down in books, because books obviously have their place, but there's nothing more powerful in life than relationships. And that podcast you can pick it up at podcast.cloudfmgroup.com, or you can pick it up on my website, jeffdewing.co.uk, or it's on all the podcast platforms. And this season, which is season 3, which I'm really proud of, that we've just launched, is also available on YouTube. So you can actually watch it as well as listen to it if you choose to.
That's terrific. Well, thank you for the beginning, I hope, of developing a relationship.
Yeah.
You've been formidable, and I mean that as because you stand for the right things, you've learned them, you don't push it down people's throats. When you're formidable, and you stand for something, you attract people towards you, so you don't have to push anything on them, and you've really got that. So thank you, Jeff, for being on, and to our listeners, thank you, and please share this episode, and please, if you can offer up reviews on Apple Podcasts, that helps. And thank you for your continuing support. And when wake up calls come your way, wake up. And don't beat up on yourself, because there is a bus line. It's the wake up call bus line. So if you miss the next wake up call, the next one will be coming along. So just wake up sooner than later, and we will see you again. Take care, everyone.